Tonight, we open with an operation that Western intelligence officials are privately describing as a turning point, not because of what was destroyed, but because of what was exposed. For nearly 3 years, this war has followed an unspoken rule. Ukrainian strikes hit bases, logistics hubs, ammunition depots. They damaged Russia's ability to fight, but never Russia's sense of personal safety at the very top. That rule is now broken. 48 hours ago, Ukraine executed a precision operation that crossed a psychological boundary the Kremlin had repeatedly warned must never be crossed. And when that boundary was breached, Moscow did not answer with fury. It answered with silence. Not the silence of confidence, but the silence of shock. According to multiple Western intelligence assessments, Ukrainian long-range drones penetrated one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the Russian Federation and impacted inside the outer security zone of Vladimir Putin's private Black Sea residence, a location long treated as untouchable, symbolic, and absolutely secure. This was not a strike against a base, not a command post, not a weapons facility. It was a message. And for the first time in this war, that message was aimed directly at Putin's personal world. Picture the moment. Just before 4 a.m. along the Black Sea coast. No moon, minimal civilian activity. Inside the fortified estate, protected by layered air defenses, naval early warning systems, and elite Federal Protective Service units, operators monitor radar feeds that are supposed to guarantee one thing: nothing gets through. Those guarantees failed. Ukrainian drones entered Russian airspace, not randomly, but deliberately probing response times, exploiting radar blind spots, forcing defensive systems to activate and reveal themselves. And then the realization set in. The flight paths weren't heading toward infrastructure. They weren't heading toward Crimea's frontline defenses. They were converging on a single, highly restricted zone: Putin's residence. Multiple projectiles penetrated deep enough to trigger internal security alarms inside the perimeter, a scenario Russian planners had publicly insisted was impossible. For the men responsible for protecting the Russian president, aerospace commanders, naval leadership, and presidential security chiefs, this was the ultimate failure. Not a battlefield loss, a credibility collapse. What made this operation truly alarming for Western analysts was not the strike itself, but the preparation behind it. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Ukrainian operational patterns changed. Intelligence services noticed unusual movements of long-range drone units. Electronic warfare assets quietly repositioned. Communication channels that normally showed constant activity went dark. When Ukrainian command goes silent, something significant is coming. For 2 years, Kyiv had followed a carefully managed escalation model, avoiding direct leadership targets to preserve Western support and limit uncontrolled retaliation. That model no longer served Ukraine's strategic reality. Patience ran out. Constraints loosened. Capabilities expanded. Ukrainian leadership reached a conclusion that intelligence officials in Washington recognize instantly. If following the old rules guarantees slow defeat, the rules stop mattering. So Ukraine made a calculated decision. If Russian cities could burn nightly while Putin remained psychologically insulated, that imbalance had to end. Here is what Western analysts believe actually happened. Ukraine launched a coordinated swarm of approximately a dozen long-range UAVs, a mixed package designed not for destruction, but for saturation. The goal was to overwhelm air defenses, confuse tracking systems, and ensure penetration. The operation relied on months of intelligence collection, precise mapping of radar coverage gaps, temporary electronic warfare suppression, flight algorithms exploiting known weaknesses in Russian tracking systems. This was not symbolic improvisation. It was professional, deliberate, and authorized at the highest levels. Ukrainian command fully understood the implications that Moscow could frame this as an assassination-adjacent act, that escalation thresholds would be tested, and that several rungs on the escalation ladder were being skipped at once. That is why the aftermath mattered more than the strike itself. Because Moscow didn't respond the way it said it would. There was no massive retaliation. no dramatic escalation, no catastrophic response. Instead, Russia quietly reshuffled air defense assets. Internal investigations were launched. Defensive systems were pulled back to protect leadership zones. Even Russian military bloggers, normally aggressive and loyal, openly questioned why the Kremlin appeared frozen. The threat machine stalled. And that silence told intelligence agencies everything they needed to know. Ukraine wasn't just testing defenses. It was testing deterrence. And deterrence failed. The most significant impact of this operation isn't military. It's psychological. Putin's authority rests on one core illusion: personal invulnerability. The belief that consequences stop at the perimeter of his power. This strike shattered that illusion. He cannot publicly acknowledge the incident without admitting failure. He cannot fully ignore it without signaling weakness to his own security services. That trap between denial and vulnerability creates instability inside authoritarian systems. History is clear on this. When Tokyo was bombed in 1942, the damage was limited, but Japan's strategic psychology changed overnight. When a teenage pilot landed beside the Kremlin in 1987, it exposed the hollowness behind Soviet defense claims and triggered mass dismissals. These moments don't end wars immediately. They change how leaders think, and sometimes how they panic. What makes this moment so dangerous is not what Ukraine struck, it's what Russia failed to do afterward. In war, retaliation is often louder than the attack itself. But here, the response never came. No overwhelming counterstrike. No dramatic escalation. No televised declaration of revenge. Instead, a sudden shift inside Moscow's security apparatus. Defensive units quietly repositioned, commanders summoned behind closed doors. Air defense assets pulled inward, away from the front, toward the center of power. That tells us something critical. When a state feels confident, it responds outward. When it feels threatened, it turns inward. For years, the Kremlin cultivated the image of total control, layered defenses, impenetrable airspace, absolute security around the president. That image was not just for foreign audiences. It was for Russia's own system, for generals, for security services, for elites whose loyalty depends on believing the center is untouchable. That belief has now been shaken. Because once a leader's personal safety enters the battlefield, the nature of the war changes. Decisions become faster, risks increase, miscalculations multiply, and the margin for error disappears. This is the moment analysts have been watching for not the end of the war, but the moment when pressure reaches the very top, where rational strategy often gives way to instinct. And that brings us to one unavoidable reality. Tonight, one conclusion stands out. Ukraine has demonstrated reach. Russian air defenses have been exposed. Red lines have lost their meaning. And for the first time since this war began, the war has entered Vladimir Putin's personal space. The Kremlin is quiet not because it is calm, but because it is recalculating. Because tonight, Putin learned something he was never meant to learn. His defenses are not absolute. His threats are not guaranteed. And this war is no longer safely distant. It's at his door. This story is not finished. And neither are the consequences. Thank you for watching. Stay alert. Good night.